Good afternoon, everybody. It's Chris Hall here, and welcome to another Charity Digital webinar day. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you're all continuing to stay safe. I've been combating the 6 weeks of lockdown with a little bit of normality. As you can probably see, I've actually made an effort to put a shirt on this week, and I've got the jeans to match as well. And that's actually been quite nice. As you can see, though, still haven't braved the haircut. Let us know how you've been dealing with lockdown this week in the chat. I mean, it's always good to share ideas, and I'm always looking for a few more myself. I wanted to kick us off today by saying a big thank you, first of all, to all the charities who've reached out to us with their positive stories of how they're adapting to remote working. And we've actually partnered with Cast and the Catalyst, who have been doing the same. And we're going to be releasing a bunch of those stories on our site and on their site over the next month. A more recent story is about how Growing Links charity called Growing Links, and how they are using social media to get food to those who need it. Do head over and check it out it's on the homepage of our site when you get them more. We are continuing to run a bunch of content to help charities stay positive and stay brave throughout this new digital journey that a lot of us are having to embark on. But I did actually want to flag something else to you. We also have a catalogue of discounted and donated software that can also help you ease the transition. And it's not always something a lot of charities know about when it comes to Charity Digital. Through our exchange program, you can actually get discounted rates on the likes of Office 365 cloud service, which gives you access to Teams, SharePoint, and the full Office suite. And we also have a 50% discount on the Zoom Business and Pro plan. And since we're talking about security today, you can also get Avast antivirus software, which starts at just £6 a seat. If you think you'll benefit from these, we have all that and a lot more at the charitydigital.org.uk/products. Please do head over and check it out. But on to today's webinar. I think today's webinar is a particularly important one in my book anyways. We've spent the last few weeks changing the way we operate and with so many things to adapt to and sometimes recreate entirely. Security, while being incredibly important, is often the one we push aside. And unfortunately, with any period of change and uncertainty, criminals will never be far away in their attempts to manipulate situations like this. And with that in mind, we have brought back Cub from the National Cybersecurity Centre to cover the types of attacks they are seeing during the lockdown, and the steps you can take to adapt your defences and security to keep those criminals at bay. A quick reminder of the house rules before we do dive in. Again, we are doing this fully remotely as we have been for the last few weeks. So please give us a little bit of forgiveness if things do go awry and connections start to break up. Just hang with us a second and we'll address it and we'll move forward. We will be hosting the Q&A as always at the end of this session. So please do hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and let us know what you want to ask. And of course, as always, the resources will be available after the webinar ends. That's the slides and the recording we'll be sending out through email in the next few weeks. And that's house rules covered. So that means it's time to hand over to Cub. Cub, welcome. It's great to have you with us again, as always.
There we go. Thanks, Chris. Typical first chance, and I don't unmute the microphone. So thank you all very much for coming. It is really good to be back on the webinars, albeit in a very different way to sitting in Charity Digital's office, doing this in what feels like a very different time. So I'm going to just run through what we're going to cover today. So we're just going to start with a very brief introduction to NCSC. I'm very conscious that we've done a lot of webinars with Charity Digital, but there's a lot of people on today, and I imagine some people who aren't that familiar with NCSC. So we'll just explain a little bit about who we are. We'll go on to the ways that COVID-19 has changed technology use, discuss the ways that we're using differently, the ways that perhaps we're using new technology, and a little bit around what that means for security posture as a whole. From there, we'll talk a little bit around how COVID-19 has changed the cyber threat. Has it actually changed the threat? How are people reacting to it? And what we can then do. And from there, we'll go on to, I think, personally, the most important part of the session, which is the steps that you can take to protect your charity. I think that's, the reason most people are here today and where we'll spend most of the time from today's session. I'll kind of run through that bit along with the slides, but obviously if there are any questions, as Chris said, just drop them into the Q&A at any time and we will come back to those at the end. It's possible that your question will be answered as we go through. If it is, great. If not, we'll definitely pick up on those. And then the final bit that we're just going to cover today is introducing a new service from NCSE. It's called the Suspicious Email Reporting Service. It's something that actually has been born out of feedback in sessions like this from members of both, the public, private and voluntary sectors and citizens as a whole. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about that today. So the first bit really just to cover today is what is the National Cybersecurity Centre. So we're a government agency and we're responsible for making the UK the safest place to live and work online, which is quite an ambitious goal and something that we're really committed to trying to achieve. The image of cybersecurity within the UK very much is the image on your left there, which is of a hacker sitting behind a wall that looks like the Matrix. They wear a hoodie, they're inherently male, and this kind of myth is sort of perpetuated a little bit by Hollywood films and programs that probably most of us have all been binge watching while we've been at home for the last 6 or 7 weeks. We're trying to move the narrative away from that a little bit and actually talking much more around the image that's on the right-hand side of your screen, which is it's just a screen grab from our small charity guide, and it's about the way that really cybersecurity can be distilled down most of the time into actually quite simple buckets of activity, making sure that you take some really sensible precautions around protecting your organisation. And that's really kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to move away from that sort of slightly strange image of a hacker in a hoodie and talk much more about the action that people can take to protect themselves. And get away from the kind of myth that there's nothing that can be done. The criminals will always win, because it's absolutely not true. And hopefully, for those of you that haven't seen one of these webinars before, we'll see that today. So the first bit really just to kind of cover is how COVID-19 has changed the way we're using technology. So I think the first bit I would say is that we are using technology more. I did a little bit of an audit of my diary when I was writing the slides for this session. And last week I did 21 video teleconferences, so Zoom calls, Microsoft Teams calls, that kind of thing. Then there were some phone calls in addition to that. There was emails, there was instant messages. I don't think I've ever done 21 video calls in a week. I'd be surprised, and I started to think about this, would I even have done 21 meetings in a week? So we are using technology more and more and more. We're using it both in our work life, we're using it in our home life, whether that's family quizzes over video or something like that. And as a result, it's becoming much, much more essential to the way we operate. If you're in normal times, if your broadband at home or in the office went down for a few hours, it's not really the end of the world. You go do something else. Perhaps you go to the shops, go see some friends, possibly even nip to a neighbour and use their Wi-Fi if it was really essential. At the moment, we can't do that. So we're much more reliant on the technology that we have. And as we've seen from some of the figures in the news, software companies are getting more and more people onboarded onto their software. We've also lost that kind of safety net that we had in the office. A lot of people felt that they could separate their lives out a little bit. Your home life was where you used certain IT, it was where you did certain things with technology. That might be from using a smart TV, perhaps listening to digital radio through Alexa, or perhaps just even searching the web on an iPad. That's very different to then what they might do in the office. And in the office, they had that safety net of knowing that perhaps there was an IT person or an IT team that they could ask for help. Even just their colleagues. We've all turned our chairs around and asked a colleague, does this email look weird to you? Or, does this website look a bit iffy? Does something look wrong here? And people have lost that safety net. And for a lot of people, that can be quite worrying. And we'll talk a little bit about fear on the next slide. But it has created a very different operating environment for people. They perhaps don't have a home office, sort of in inverted commas, to to use. They might be just sitting at the kitchen table, and that can make people's use of technology very different. We've seen, as I sort of begun to mention earlier, a lot more deployment of new software, whether that's deploying video conferencing software, whether it's bringing in new kind of collaborative working tools. That creates is absolutely fantastic and enables much more effective working while you're at home. But it also creates potential vulnerabilities if those things aren't deployed correctly and safely as organizations do it. So when we talk a little bit around things you can do to secure yourself, we'll talk about deployment of software in that section. And then finally, the sort of last way it's changed our use of technology significantly is around bring your own device. Bring your own device is sort of one of those odd terms that we use to kind of refer to where people use their personal device to access work or corporate services. Now, in normal times, it can be quite common, but generally people sort of tend to have a work laptop, perhaps a work mobile, and they use those for work and they use their personal ones for personal use. But at the moment, those lines have been much more blurred because, we're not, as I said earlier, going into the office. We're not sort of going into work in that traditional sense. And for some organisations, particularly charities where funds are not infinite, it may be that the only way to keep your staff working at this point in time is to allow them access the corporate systems through their own devices. It might not have been something that you're particularly happy with in normal times, but at the moment has become a necessity of how you need to work to function as an organisation. So with that, it does create some new risks, and bring your own device as a strategy for technology needs to be incorporated appropriately and with some sensible safeguards, which we'll go on to talk a little bit about later, but we have a lot of guidance on the website to help you with that as well. So we'll move on from there to how COVID-19 has changed the cyber threat. The first question I'd probably pose here really is, firstly, has it? Yes, we're using technology in a slightly different way, but the virus and the situation we now find ourselves in hasn't dramatically changed the technology that we're all using. I think what it's done is change the way that we're using it. We're not kind of trying to invent new pieces of software or anything. Cyber criminals, we haven't seen a significant or sort of statistically significant increase in the amount of cybercrime, but what they are doing is capitalizing on the fear of coronavirus and COVID-19. And that fear is something that, exists within an awful lot of people at the moment. They're afraid of, for their own health, but that kind of translates into fear of other things as well. So we've seen a lot of phishing attacks that are using COVID-19 as the hook to lull someone in. That kind of traditional social engineering that we've talked about a lot in some of the previous webinars. We've seen the cyber criminals using that as the hook to get people to do something, whether that's, trying to say, here's the latest advice on coronavirus, click here to download it. It might be trying to get people to read some articles about, new cures for the virus, perhaps some previously unknown information. And at this point in time, some of them seem a little bit unlikely that people would click on it. But actually, at the moment, people want answers. They want some certainty. And criminals are fantastic at capitalizing on that and really trying to twist our honesty and turn it into something bad. So we are seeing that, but we're not seeing any significant increase in the volume of those types of attacks. It's just the way that they're being targeted to prey on the fears of COVID-19 and things like that. With new home working infrastructure, it does create certain vulnerabilities if they're not configured properly. Previously it would be the case that you only need to generally access corporate systems from within the office, within that safety net that we talked about earlier. But from that, it does create some potential vulnerabilities if that new home working infrastructure hasn't been configured properly. And I think for a lot of organizations, one of the biggest worries has been the speed in which they've had to adapt. So, you know, we went from people saying, you know, well, we'll try and work at home a little bit more, through to we're all locked down, you have to be at home now, within a matter of weeks. Now, if you sort of think about normal technology sort of testing cycles and development processes, those can typically take weeks, if not months, to really make sure people are happy. And as a result, it's likely that in that deployment and in the run up to kind of the situation we're now in, people will have had to make assumptions, or perhaps not been able to test things as much as they would like, and that potentially has left vulnerabilities in corporate IT systems. The last bit I just kind of want to flag here around the cyber threat is video conferencing. So we have all very much adopted video conferencing. I talked a second ago about how much I've been using it. People are using it both in personal and in work times. And we've seen a lot of stories in the news, you know, questioning the security of video conferencing software. There's been some, you know, quite awful stories around Zoom bombing, which I think is, you know, a term that will probably be one of those words that was created in 2020 and will get turned into the Oxford Dictionary, I imagine. But you know, we've seen some really horrible stories of people sharing quite graphic images by Zoom bombing conversations. What I think I'd kind of like to just sort of highlight there is the problems inherently haven't been with the video conferencing software themselves. It's been in the way that they're being used and the ability to control who can put things on screen or who can attend meetings and things like that. So you'll have all seen today, just as an example with this webinar, myself and the team at Charities Digital, we're all on here as panelists. That's what the system has called us. So we're the only people that are allowed to talk or transmit our video or put things up on screen. Everybody else has attended as an attendee, so you can put questions in the Q&A, but that's as much as you can do, and that's intentionally about limiting what people would be able to do if they got onto our call. And obviously this is an open one. You've signed up for the webinar, but you know, anybody with an email address and willing to sign up could have done that. You may want to look, and we'll talk about this later, about different controls for different types of meetings and webinars and calls that you have. But video conferencing has definitely changed the cyber threat a little bit, because it's opened up a quite different and new avenue that's being used quite a lot by organizations. So I'll move on to probably, I think, in my view, the most important part today, and something we'll spend the most time on. And that's around protecting your charity from cyber attacks. Now, I think, you know, a lot of the questions we've been asked in advance of this webinar and some of the other ones that I've done recently are, do we need to do things drastically differently? And I think the first thing I'll say is the basics are still the basics. Making sure that, you know, you're helping your users to create strong passwords, they're doing their updates, that you have backups of all of the important data for your organization, that you're monitoring your network. Those remain essential. That hasn't changed. And that, to be honest, won't change whether we're in a pandemic or a heightened period of cyber attacks. All of those basics remain the basics for a reason, because actually they are the most common way that criminals seek to launch cyber attacks, either by password spraying attacks, trying to find vulnerabilities in unpatched or unupdated pieces of software, and things like that. So making sure those basics are still in place is the most critical thing you can do. Hence why you'll have seen I've underlined it and stuck an exclamation mark after it. But you know, the basics really do remain so. And I think if you're not confident that you've got the basics in place, I'd really encourage you afterwards to have a look at the Small Charity Guide. It covers 5 areas, most of which I've just read out, which are you know, really essential to get right in your charity before you move on to some of the other things that I'll talk about during this session. So definitely, first and foremost, the basics are still the most important thing, and please do check that you've got those in place and don't allow the more jazzy bits of cybersecurity to overtake your priorities there. The next thing I would say is around supporting your staff and volunteers. You know, this is a really difficult time. We talked a lot about fear and the fear that people have of both COVID, but also using IT in a very different way. Criminals are playing on that fear, and just because most of us on this call, I imagine, by the fact you're engaging with Charities Digital, you're fairly tech savvy or wanting to be, it doesn't mean that others are. And those wider fears of the virus will manifest themselves in kind of fears of technology and doing new things, and things like that. Asking yourself, do your staff and volunteers know how to seek help? The last thing people want to feel is cut off in their time of need, because they can't get in touch with IT, they can't report something that they think doesn't look right. Within the office, again, this is a really easy thing to do. They pick up the phone, they shout across the office to whoever they normally tell about things that are wrong with the IT or potential security issues that they've seen. But do they know where to seek help? Are you putting out clear, consistent comms around new pieces of software, how to use the software that you have? Are they always coming from the same email address? The last thing you want people to do is to begin questioning themselves about the fact that messages from IT are coming from lots of different inboxes. Certainly within our organisation, all of the internal comms messages and IT messages come from the same place, so that we always know if it comes from that address, it's legit, we can read it, and we can have that sort of semblance of security from that. And that's a really kind of important part that goes beyond just cybersecurity into kind of working in amongst your internal comms people, whoever does that internal communication within your organisation, and making sure that IT messages are part of that same package of communication and it's not confusing people. And really remember that your staff and your volunteers are your strongest link. They're your eyes and ears on the ground. They will be the first people to spot something wrong with your IT systems. If a piece of software goes down, you can almost guarantee the first time you'll realize about it is when you start getting inundated with emails and phone calls from your staff and your volunteers. And try and treat them as an asset that they are, rather than the liability that I often hear kind of staff and volunteers being talked about in. Yes, historically people have referred to your staff as the weakest link. I think personally for me that's really wrong. I think actually they're your strongest asset and they need to be treated as such, particularly at this time where they're already feeling a bit worried about how to use technology in the safest way. So that's supporting your staff and volunteers. The next bit is really around controlling access to the systems that you have. So many of you will probably be using a VPN, which is a virtual private network. And VPNs essentially allow remote access into your corporate systems by creating an encrypted network connection that authenticates the user or the device to the network, and critically also encrypts that data in transit between the user and your services. At the moment, if you do have one deployed, make sure it's fully patched. With the increase in data that is going over a VPN as people kind of working from outside the office, you need to make sure it's patched. Those security updates are there for a reason. They are really, really important to make sure that actually you're keeping your systems as protected as they can be. You might want to begin to think about, and perhaps you've already had to when this first all's happened, to think about purchasing additional licenses. You might want to buy more capacity in your VPN. This just helps to avoid those kind of frustrating phone calls from your staff and your volunteers saying, I can't get particularly fast connection on my device, or my video call or whatever it might be keeps dropping out, and that might be because of the bandwidth that you've got available in your VPN. The thing you want to do at the moment is make it as easy as possible for people to use that technology. If you don't have a VPN in place and you're not sure whether one is right for you, there's a quite lengthy and sort of covering all bases piece of guidance to advise you on that on the NCSC website. If you just go to ncsc.gov.uk and put VPN, that's VPN, into the search bar, it will come up, and that will give you a really good idea of whether a VPN would be a good solution for you. I won't go into too much of the detail now because it's quite a lengthy topic as to whether you should deploy one in the first place, and actually depends on a lot of different Oh, hang on, I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry, my screen is just.
We can hear you, Cobb.
Good. Sorry, my screen locked. That's technology getting in the way again. I'll try and keep wiggling my mouse as I talk. Just continue on that sort of controlling access to corporate systems point. Many of you are probably using cloud services, whether that's Office 365 or the Google G Suite. It's worth just considering now that you're kind of reaching a sort of new business as usual, how your users are authenticating themselves to those services, particularly if they're using either corporate devices externally, or perhaps you're allowing them to use their own personal devices to access those. How is it that they authenticate themselves through the portals? Do you need to look at perhaps putting in place some new controls? So are you monitoring attempted logins, in particular, the location of those? There is one thing that for the majority of charities at the moment, you can pretty much guarantee people won't be logging into your corporate systems from abroad. If they are, then that probably raises some questions either about whether it's actually them or whether they've somehow managed to catch a flight abroad at the moment. But consider that, and actually perhaps even at this point in time, if none of your people are abroad, you can block access requests from outside of a defined geographic area, which might be quite useful at the moment. It just limits the number of people that could even try and access your accounts. Do you have multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, as it's often called, turned on? You don't necessarily need to turn it on so that every time someone tries to log in, it requires it. It might be perhaps you only ask for it when someone's logging in from a new device, a new location. Perhaps they haven't used it in sort of more than a set period of days or perhaps a couple of weeks or something, and you just get them to authenticate that it's them. It does it very simply, often by either sending a text to your mobile phone, and then they just put in normally sort of a 6 or 8 digit code or something like that to authenticate themselves to the system. But it's a really great way of stopping the wrong people getting into your systems, because it requires something that person knows, their password, and then something that they have their mobile phone so that they can receive the text. And it just adds an extra layer of protection, particularly if you're allowing people to access your corporate systems from an internet-facing interface. The next thing I'll go on to from there, and obviously, again, if there are any questions as we go through this, I realise I'm rattling through fairly quickly on some of these, and please do drop them in the Q&A, and we'll very happily go back to those at the end. Is to think carefully about new deployments. Just because we're in an unprecedented situation, it doesn't mean that governance needs to go out the window. I'd really encourage you not to move away too far from your existing procurement processes, your security, verification processes for new software. It will obviously depend on how much you need it. Is it something that's essential? Is it something that just a couple of users would like, as opposed to something that you really need? I think there's some that are much more obviously needed at this point in time, such as video conferencing software, the ability to communicate easily, using some sort of collaborative tools with your colleagues. Those seem quite essential. Now might not be the time to be investing in new sort of video editing software and things like that perhaps are going to distract the IT team or your security colleagues away from making sure they're looking after the crown jewels and the bread and butter of your IT systems at the moment. And I just say, as a people potentially on this call responsible for the security, think about your capacity and begin to, escalate that up to seniors, to the senior leadership team, perhaps even to the board, about what you can actually handle at the moment. Because the last thing you want to do is take on more deployments or more, security processes than you can actually handle, because then things begin to get missed. And those basics that we talked about at the beginning are quite often the first things to get forgotten about in lieu of trying to focus on the new bits that people want, the new software deployments, things like that. So just, think carefully about those deployments. If anybody would like some broader guidance around deploying software as a service, for example, again, we've got a really good piece of guidance on our website that talks you through the principles that you should be applying when deploying any new software as a service. Again, if you just go to the NCSC website and put in SaaS or software as a service, it will come up, and hopefully that will be useful to you. One of the big fears that people have at the moment is around ransomware, and we have got some really good guidance out there about ransomware. I just want to pick up on a couple of the key points to mitigate that threat of ransomware, and I'll talk about it in two ways. So it all centers around backups. Now, obviously, the best defense for ransomware is making sure that you've updated your software, you've got some sort of antivirus, anti-malware software sort of programs in place. But actually, that's all well and good, but actually if a ransomware does get onto your system, the best defense to be able to recover quickly is your backups. So I'm going to talk about it in two senses. The first off is offline backups. So if you're using the more traditional offline backups, and I'll talk around cloud backups second. So in terms of offline backups, the key action to mitigate ransomware is to ensure that you have up-to-date backups of your important files. And I say important files because in making backing up as easy as possible, you need to kind of avoid backing up literally everything. You don't need the kitchen sink. You probably only need the really essential files that your organization cannot do without. And it's worth doing a little bit of an audit sometimes of your backups to make sure that threshold is still being applied equally. If you've got those up-to-date backups, you'll be able to recover your data without having to pay a ransom. And that's the main aim of a backup. If you've got good backups, you won't have to pay that ransom because you'll be able to recover much more quickly. It will still take some time. It is, unfortunately, very annoying and can be really destructive to an organization, but it will mean that you don't have to pay ransom, which is essentially putting money in the hands of criminals. But make sure the device that's containing your backup, perhaps it's an external hard drive, or for much smaller organizations, even just a USB stick, is not permanently connected to your network, and that ideally you've got multiple copies. That's for many reasons. One being, obviously, if you lose your backup, your external hard drive, perhaps your bag gets stolen or something like that, or it gets stolen from the office in a physical robbery, you want to be able to have multiple copies that you can turn to. And make sure that it is disconnected from the network, as purely just because an attacker may choose to launch a ransomware attack when they know that the storage containing the backups is connected. So making sure it's disconnected when it's not actually doing the backup is really important. So that's offline backups, and just something I wanted to highlight there because that is a really simple but effective way of mitigating the threat of ransomware. I'll talk second now on cloud backups. So there's a couple of quite important factors to consider. And first off is could ransomware overwrite your cloud backup, preventing your recovery? You want to look for a service that keeps multiple versions of backed up data, or which allows you to undo changes to backups. And that purely just means that if the ransomware infected a file, which then got into the backup, would that encrypt your entire backup and essentially render it null and void? And that's why we say multiple versions of backed up data, or that function to go backwards, in simple terms, literally just clicking undo on a Word document, but you're doing it on changes to your whole backup. Does the cloud service provider that you've chosen have multi-factor authentication available to protect your backup? The reason we ask this is purely because we've seen in the past criminals have got into networks. They've then managed to get enough sort of privilege in the accounts that they're using to turn off the backups, and then waited a little while and then deployed the ransomware. And that's had a potentially quite devastating effect, because backups people thought they had actually had been turned off for quite a while, and don't have the latest week, couple of weeks, months of data. So if it does have multi-factor authentication, please make sure you've implemented it and turned it on. Do you carefully manage the ability to modify or delete those backups? Make sure that you limit the number of accounts with the ability to access backups. And that purely means the last thing you want is for, someone who works in a team completely unrelated to IT, or perhaps someone who doesn't deal with the backups within the IT team, having access to the backups, potentially either accidentally overwriting them, accidentally deleting them, or if their account is compromised, you don't want the attackers to be able to use their account to gain access to the backup. So just by limiting that to a smaller number of people as possible, just helps you to maintain that control over your backups. And then just in terms of if you did suffer a ransomware attack, will your cloud service provider be able to ship the data back to you to aid in the recovery from that kind of incident, either in an electronic form, or perhaps even putting it on some sort of external device and actually physically shipping it back to you is sometimes much easier for organizations to recover. And finally, and this will only sort of be relevant if it makes sense to you, is if you have client software on premise, check the schedule of the incremental cloud backups. If you don't have client software on premise, then that one won't apply to you, but please do check the schedule of those incremental backups if you do have it on premise. So that really was probably a bit of a segue into kind of backups as a whole, but really, really important for ransomware. We published a number of blogs recently to draw attention to this, just because when it comes to the types of incidents that we see, having those backups in place is one of the most important things when it comes to ransomware. It just speeds up the recovery massively. And then the final thing I'll go on to say around protecting your charity is around video conferencing. So we get asked a lot about how to set up video conferencing to be secure. And I sort of use secure in that sort of slightly distance way, because it's very hard to judge, and it will obviously depend on how you're configuring your systems and how you're using something. But there's a really extensive piece of guidance on our website that covers sort of all of the areas you should consider when either procuring or making sure that an existing video conferencing piece of software is secure for the way that you're using it. But I pulled a couple of snippets which I just want to cover now. And they mostly relate to being able to control who is within those meetings and helping your staff and users do that. So, being able to control who can join or perhaps even initiate meetings will help protect the confidentiality of those discussions and obviously prevent unwanted interruptions. Participants usually join those meetings in advance by clicking on a link, by entering a unique code. And there's a couple of things we'd recommend here, which is that users from your organization and perhaps even external guests that were specifically invited into the meeting are allowed to go straight into meetings. And this is all around how you configure it within the backend when you deploy it. Unauthenticated users, so those that you haven't invited or haven't specifically given an invite to, should be required to enter a passcode. That just means obviously that you've given them that extra piece of information they need to know, perhaps send it in a separate email or something like that. And unauthenticated users should be held in a waiting area. It's often called the lobby on video conferencing software, and only be admitted into that meeting once their identity has been verified by one of the trusted participants, usually the meeting host. And the reason for this is think about the way that we use video conferencing in sort of a technological sense, but think of it more in the way that you protect your meetings. And when you're putting them together, think about, would you be comfortable having this meeting in a coffee shop? Would you be comfortable having this meeting in an open plan office where anybody that's near you can hear? Or is it a meeting that you would only want to have behind closed doors in a meeting room? And apply that kind of same logic to the way that you set up different types of meetings. So obviously a meeting like this isn't that different to being physically at a conference. So we're quite happy that everybody can hear what we're saying, can see what's on the screen and things like that. And we've not applied too many controls for people to get there, because for us, the most important thing today is that people can access the meeting securely. Now, if me and Charities Digital were having a confidential discussion about their own cybersecurity, we'd want to make sure that meeting was very much locked down. Only the people that had been invited could get into it, and that a password or some form of authentication was needed before they could get in. But the bit that I would build upon, what you can do in the back end to set up those controls is making sure that your users know how to use video conferencing securely and safely. I know we're kind of a number of weeks into this sort of period of lockdown now, but it's really important to kind of take stock and work out whether perhaps, some internal webinars or something might be helpful to your staff and volunteers. Perhaps consider sharing your screen to show them how to use some of those security settings, how to create meetings in the most secure way for different audiences. Is it an internal only meeting? Is it an external, one-to-ones, larger meetings, etc.? Video conferencing has become part of the new normal we keep being talked to about, and it's important that your colleagues don't get left behind, as has often been the case in significant shifts in technology in the past. So make sure you take them along that journey with you. If they know how to use it securely, it will just massively increase the overall security posture of your organisation. So those are kind of the things I really want to flag around protecting your charity from attacks. Obviously, if there's bits that have popped up as I've been talking, we'll cover them in a second in the Q&A. But the final bit I wanted to talk about is our suspicious email reporting service. So this is something that has been quite a long time in the making. And effectively, we have created a service that you can send all of your suspicious emails to. It's a really simple address. It's on your screens now. We're going to leave it there for as long as I can as I talk about this. That's essentially report@phishing.gov.uk. And all you need to do is forward any emails that you think are suspicious to that address. The automated system will analyse and find any malicious links or attachments within that email. If any are found, we'll take action to either take them down from the internet using our takedown provider, or pass the details to an internet service provider and get them blocked. So essentially, in the simplest terms, by forwarding emails to that address that you think are suspicious, you're actually helping to keep the UK safer from online crime and scams. We launched the service about 2 weeks ago, and as of Monday this week, we'd received 130,000 reports. And from those 130,000, obviously a lot of duplicates, a lot of people get sent the same scams. There were 1,099 new domains in there, which means there were 1,099 new phishing attacks that members of the public had identified and helped us now take down or block. And obviously, the first question we often get is, well, surely the criminals are just going to go and create a new domain. Yes, potentially they might well do. But what we're trying to do in sort of making the UK the safest place to live and work online is make it that much harder. We're trying to move the goalposts for criminals so that it is not financially viable for them to be doing this anymore. It makes cyber criminality much harder. It's not something that you can easily do from your kitchen table. We're trying to bring up the cost of being a cyber criminal such that it's not profitable anymore, and that's how we'll drive this away. So we're really asking for your help. Please do report any emails you think are suspicious to the address. This is phase one that we launched about 2 weeks ago. We're hoping to roll out a bulk reporting option for organisations in future phases, which will allow, if you have a central place that you ask your staff to forward any phishing emails they get at work to, you'd then be able to send us bulk reports at a time to flag those to us. But that's not available at the moment. So in the meantime, if you do have any as an organisation that you want to send us, please just send them one at a time, and we can take them in that form at the moment. But obviously, we'll put out some communication once the bulk reporting is available in the next couple of phases. If you don't kind of believe us in terms of how successful it's been so far, I think I will leave it in the hands of the nation's favourite scam buster, Martin Lewis, who gave it a big endorsement last week. We've worked, obviously with a lot of organisations to make sure that this is right for the public, and we're really hoping that it will be a useful service for you to use. So the link's on there. It's report@phishing.gov.uk. Please do jot it down, share it amongst your friends, your family, your colleagues, and really just help us to try and increase the number of reports we get to there and take those sites down. As I promised, we're going to wrap up my content there. That's kind of all I wanted to cover today, and move on to the Q&A bit, which I think Chris has been pulling together some questions as we went through. I'll hand over to Chris.
Absolutely. Thanks. First of all, thanks very much, Cub. Another great session as always. And just want to obviously endorse this service that you've just rolled out as well. It's a great idea. I'm glad to see something like that taken off, to echo sort of Martin's words as well. It's great to finally have a place to send all these things, because previously it was just that Microsoft sort of report this as scam button. But what happens with that, you never really know. It just kind of goes off into the ether. So great to have this, and certainly something I'll be using in the future, as we do get quite a fair amount of phishing attacks ourselves. But we have had loads of questions coming in, as I'm sure you'll be aware. I've kind of tried to bracket some of them together. There's a lot of questions specifically about Zoom, as I'm sure I'm sure you thought would come down the pipeline. So I thought we better tackle those ones first, and then we can get into some of the nitty gritty. So the first question from Will Sadler. We've heard a lot in the news about the security concerns around Zoom. Can you tell us what charitable organisations who are doing video conferencing with vulnerable groups, sometimes sharing personal information and confidential information, can do to mitigate the risks of using the Zoom platform? I know you covered some, but it might be good just to reiterate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the analogy of kind of comparing video conferencing to sort of a more physical meeting is definitely very relevant here, because obviously you wouldn't be having a lot of those conversations. Sorry, I'm just going to try and mute. The joys of working from home is that myself and my other half are sharing an office, and her laptop's now pinging at us. So so that analogy to a physical office is definitely true. Obviously, a lot of those conversations you're having with vulnerable service users, you wouldn't be having a coffee shop, you wouldn't be having an office. So it's important to treat the video calls that you have with them as a locked meeting room. And as a result, and there is obviously some challenges around access here, but make sure that any meetings you have with those service users are password protected, that you send them a specific link to join that meeting. It's not a link that you use across all of your meetings. The last thing you would want is multiple service users crossing over with each other on a Zoom call, because that obviously breaches certain bits of confidentiality. Just make sure obviously that everybody has their own corporate account. So you sign up for an account as an organization. Don't allow your users to go and create their own one just on the Zoom website. The reason we say that is just because the corporate versions, they've got more security options. You've got control over how your users are accessing the service. You can make sure that you're kind of monitoring who's joining the calls and things like that. And it just gives you a lot more control over it. But what I would do is definitely point anyone who has any concerns around video conferencing to the NCSE website. We've done two articles basically. One for organisations, so that's for the people that are sort of deploying the software in the first place. That's worth having a look at. It's vendor agnostic, so it applies whatever video conferencing you're trying to use, whether that's Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Google Hangouts, whatever it might be. Definitely have a look at that if you're the one deploying it. But there's also a piece of guidance around using video conferencing as an individual, so both how to use it within a work context, but as the individual actually accessing the system, but also to help you when securing it at home. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at both of those, and please feel free to crib some of the text or just share the whole individual article with some of your service users, because it dispels some of the myths and things that we've heard about in some of the news articles. But I just make sure that you're providing people advice around using Zoom. I know I've got friends and colleagues who work with more vulnerable members in society, and a lot of the time it's the questions that they're not sure how to answer. So hopefully that individuals and families one article will help you to answer some of those, and you can give them some really clear guidance that's backed up by the NCSC badge.
Magic, thanks for that cover. And we'll actually, if you pop those resources over to us, we'll include them in the mail out with the presentation and recording as well. Will actually has a follow-up question which I find quite interesting. A risk he has identified is the danger that people are on a call with could use a simple screen recorder software to record an online session without anybody really knowing. He says he's aware that Zoom has an audio watermark on feature which helps to track down anyone who shares a Zoom recording, for example, on social media. He's wondering what your specific thoughts are on that.
I have to be honest, it's not a question I've been asked before. I think what I will do, rather than trying to guess here, I mean, I know obviously there is some advice within the guidance for individuals and families around turning on the built-in recording, so the recording on Teams or Zoom, and that alerts all the participants that it's being recorded. So, for example, most of you, I think, will see in the top bit of your screen today a flashing red light indicating that the webinar is being recorded, as you'd expect. That functionality is there, and that should flag to users. But yeah, there is unfortunately that risk of screen recorders and things being used on video calls. I would just point you to that guidance I talked about earlier, but I will go and get a much more sort of full response from some of our technical colleagues and get that across to Charities Digital to put out with the notes for this as well, because it's a really good question and not one I've been asked before, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we'll take that one offline. Thanks, Will, for that. Next question from Jane. She was asking, we talked a little bit about protecting the charity from cyber attacks, and we mentioned the basics. She was wondering, I know we've covered this in previous webinars before, and Jane, we'll send those webinars out, but if you could give us a quick 30-second elevator pitch of what those basics are, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I can. So the basics that I'd kind of flagged to you today are helping, so passwords, and I bang on about passwords, I think, in probably every webinar and every talk I do. Chris is probably very fed up of hearing about them now, but passwords are they're the best and the worst line of defense, because they are, when used well, a really secure tool to stop people who shouldn't be accessing something from accessing it. However, when used badly, they're really, really easy to guess. So we did some research as NCSC a while ago that found that 25 million people in the UK had an account with a password 123456. Now, if 25 million people are using that password, the first thing criminals are going to try and do is type in 123456 into the password box, and in a certain number of occasions, they're going to be able to get access to that. There is a lot more complicated things, and there are lists of the most common passwords that people use. And unfortunately, criminals have those, and they will try those whole lists to gain access to things. So, however, when used sensibly, and there's something we use to help people create passwords, which is called 3 random words. Quite simply, put together 3 random words. So just looking at what I can see from my office right now, you would do window with a capital W, table with a capital T, sofa with a capital S, and that creates actually quite a long password. It's got some capitals in it. It doesn't need to get overly complicated with letters and numbers and things like that. And there are a lot of people who obviously still think that it is better to have numbers, symbols, make it as complicated as unreadable as possible. The problem with that is people don't do it. People will try and find the easiest way when it comes to passwords. So that 3 random words is a good compromise between good cryptographic level of security and ease of use for the user. So that's kind of what I would say about passwords. I'll stop going on about them for a second now and go on to a couple of other bits. Make sure you do your updates, both from a corporate IT perspective, but also making sure that your users know how to update their devices if they need to do something manually on it, and really encouraging them to do it. Reminding them that actually the updates aren't just about rolling out a new piece of software or something like that. All of those updates contain critical security updates. Every time they roll out an update, I can almost guarantee there will be some sort of security information in there that just increases your resilience to new types of attacks. Make sure that you educate your staff around how to use their technology and how to respond to phishing attacks. We used to say as government, try and spot the phishing attack. Well, they're really hard to do. A lot of them are impersonating. It's no longer a prince from a faraway land offering an inheritance. it is much more legitimate things, often tailored to the type of software you're using. So they might imitate Microsoft, they might imitate Google, perhaps well-known shops that you use, Amazon and the like. So where they're imitating those, people are much more likely to fall for them. So it's not so much about telling users off for falling for phishing scams, but actually educating them on how to spot the signs if they can, but really knowing what to do if they fall for it. And then the last couple of bits is around making sure that you've got some antivirus software in place across your corporate IT estate, and that you're managing access in a sort of tiered way. So within your organization, a couple of people in IT should have that high level of access across your systems. But to be honest, other than them, you want to have a sort of tiered level going downwards towards your general staff, who really just need the least amount of privilege to be able to get their job done. The last thing you want is giving everybody the privileged domain administrator level access, that then if you do suffer an attack, it gets straight onto the network and can go anywhere that it wants. So that's my very quick run through, Chris.
Cheers, Cub. Yeah, I think there might be 300 charity professionals with the coffee table fish password that from last year's webinar. But we'll make sure to send that out with all the resources, Jin, because it is a really, really good webinar. Cub goes into quite a lot of detail on what exactly those basics are. If you haven't seen already, would definitely recommend it. I'm just going to make a note here, because I do want to flag we have reached our 2 o'clock time, but where we do have still a lot of questions to get to, so we're going to hang around and answer those. If you do need to shoot off, by all means shoot off, but feel free to stay around. We're gonna crack on and soldier through. There's a lot of fantastic questions coming through. So moving on, from Vicky Robinson, we use remote access software such as GoToMyPC. Are there any specific considerations around this versus a VPN?
So I won't be able to comment on kind of the specific types of remote access software. The couple of things I would say is understanding how your users are authenticating to that. So what are the controls that you've got in place to make sure that they are accessing it legitimately, is who you think it is. So is there an ability to turn on multi-factor authentication within that? Helping users, again, without banging on about passwords, to make sure that those are as strong, as secure as possible. I would also probably flag, if you can, and obviously this would depend on the way that you're set up, is it possible to create an allow list and a deny list? So perhaps allowing your users certain devices to access through that remote protocol, but disallowing all the others. When you first integrate that, you can almost guarantee that you'll get a whole lot of people emailing going, I can no longer access the system. But actually, if you only generally want people to access through a certain set group of devices, perhaps the ones provided by you, then that should be fairly easy to do. There is, you might know those terms more accurately as whitelisting and blacklisting. We've moved away from that to allow list and deny list, which there's a really interesting blog on our website about why we've done that, which I'd encourage you to read. But in general, it's more around the way that your users authenticate to that I'd probably flag to you, and just make sure that any kind of underlying infrastructure for that is patched, it's updated, and you understand what it is they're actually remote accessing into, and what their privileges once they're inside are. Those would be my main top tips for that bit.
Great, thanks, Cub. Alan Martin actually asked a very similar question, so I hope we managed to cover everything there for you, Alan. Let us know if not. Jane Granville does ask, and I know you can't necessarily align with specific products and services, but she asked, what cloud services do you suggest? I know from our point of view, Jane, we have a lot of resources on our site that can give you all the information you need to know about necessary products and services. I don't really want to put any additional pressure on Cub, where I know you can't necessarily align with one over the other. Is that fair to say?
I think it is. I think what I would say is consider a number of products and do as you would, any normal tendering process. Consider the pros and cons of them. Don't just look at the price, look at what they actually offer you. within certain package levels? Do you get what your organization needs, or are you suddenly going to realize 6 months down the line that actually you needed the higher level of package perhaps, and that when it actually came down to the crunch, that was more expensive or less usable than some of the other ones? So we've got some really good guidance on deploying software as a service and cloud packages on the website. So those give you some really good principles to consider as you go through. And they're all sort of vendor agnostic. So it talks about the principles that should be universally applied, not just to one individual supplier.
Great. Yeah, and we'll include those in our resources as well. Thanks, Jane. We've had a good question actually from an anonymous attendee about, especially if you're just getting started up with the remote working. Could you give a little explanation about what exactly is a VPN?
Yeah, so VPN effectively, and any of the really techie people on the call will probably be shaking their head at my description here, but in simple terms, a VPN effectively creates a tunnel for your traffic between the device that you're using at home and your normally sort of physical corporate IT systems in the office. And all it's designed to do basically is allow you to encrypt that data as it moves between somebody remote working and access to the corporate systems in the office. What it does do is also it can sort of mask a user's location and things like that. So the ones that we're kind of talking about here are the sort of corporate VPN solutions that encrypt that traffic and also you can set it so that only people accessing through the VPN can actually access the corporate systems from outside the office, which is why it's quite a useful security tool at this sort of point in time. What I would just flag is not to confuse yourself with ones that are where you're buying VPN access that are often sold as helping you to access streaming services so that you can get like the American version of Netflix and things like that. That's quite a different thing. It is about encrypting the traffic, but that's primarily about changing the location that you appear from. Those are not the same as what we're talking about when we come to sort of corporate VPNs to access your office IT, as it were. So just try and sort of separate those two things in your mind, because that might be where you've heard of VPNs more commonly in personal use.
Yeah, that's yeah, I thought that was fairly good. So well done, you. Cheers. I actually just realised we've missed a Zoom question actually, but I think we covered it. Devon asks more about they deal with local council and the police who've been told they can't join their Zoom meetings. Do you have any guidance? Which I think we covered already, saying there's those two pieces of guidance on your site that's really useful. Again, Devon will be including that in our resources afterwards. Next question from Tim Hodge. Would be interested in the size of charity IT security departments generally. How much money has been invested in cyber security staff and tools? I don't know if this is something you have a lot of information on, Cub.
Off the top of my head, it's not, but there is a lot of data in. There's a document that's been released every year, and for the last 3 years, it's had specific data on charities. It's called the Cyber Security Breaches Survey, and it looks at the whole kind of field of cybersecurity within the voluntary sector. So everything from board level understanding of it through to the funding that IT teams get and things like that, all the way through to how many incidents has a charity received in a year, how much has it lost as a result, things like that. So it looks across the whole field, and it's certainly been I know useful for some charities in making that business case around statistically the average charity loses this much every year to cybercrime and cyber-enabled fraud. If we invest X amount, we can offset that or put in place that. Because often the thing that isn't calculated in those figures, I would just say, in kind of caveating that, is the reputational damage. But in general, certainly talking to the charities that we do out on the road, very few, I would say almost no small and medium charities have dedicated security people or teams. Generally, that's in the larger ones, and often I think we find that the IT person or IT team, and perhaps even sometimes just the externally sourced provider, is responsible for all that security. I think a lot of the time that's fine, but just don't create a system where nobody at a senior level understands what's going on with the security, because it is a board level risk in the same way that data protection safeguarding organizational finances. All of these things should be considered as one, and cyber should definitely fall within that.
Thanks, Cub. The next question from Wendy Stewart. Do you have any thoughts or advice on the purchase of cyber insurance?
At the moment, no, but there is, I know, a blog coming up very soon around some top tips to take when you're considering cyber insurance. So I won't comment kind of on individual sort of cyber insurance and what to look for and what not to look for. But what I would say is consider how it's helping you either mitigate the effect of that risk or potentially reduce the cost of a cyber attack to you. So a lot of existing insurance policies, whether that's your general charity insurance, your liability insurance, whatever it might be, might have a cyber element to it. So consider that first before you go and look for specific ones. See what your coverage already is. Sometimes it's just been bolted on there. You might not even have noticed it before. Increasingly, it is a bolt-on that can be offered for an extra sum by insurance companies. Consider what it is that they're covering. Does that meet your needs? And I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot is some form of support with incidents coming as part of that insurance package. So in the same way that if your office flooded, your insurance company would probably help you with advice and guidance and help you to get back on your feet. That's certainly the case with a lot of insurance companies. We're now beginning to see insurance companies offering cyber incident response, so some sort of technical support with those incidents. That might be of value to you, but it's just worth considering exactly what it does offer you, and is it a risk that you need to mitigate to that extent, and does it offer you enough protection? The one thing I would say is please don't use cyber insurance as a reason to not invest in the security in the first place. I can guarantee you with some certainty that the effect of the cyber attack would be far worse than whatever sum they're going to pay you out at the end as a result of the cyber attack, if they even can. So yeah, don't use it instead of good security.
Very good advice. Sage-like. Thanks very much, Cub. Next question is, I think, which pertains to the protecting your charity from cyber attack section. Do you have any advice regarding backups for cloud-based services such as Office 365, Dropbox, etc.? Specific example is sort of taking a complete backup of the data held in the cloud-based services to hold offline locally.
So I think without kind of knowing exactly how you're set up on your IT systems, what I would say is don't use just a simple OneDrive account as your only backup. It is quite possible that if the malicious software, the ransomware, gets into there and then syncs with the cloud, it could, in theory, ransom your entire backup, which would not be good. So I think you've got a couple of options, and it really depends on how much data you're using effectively. You can take on a regular basis, and this is the critical bit, it needs to be regular or else those backups become null and void. A regular offline backup of, if you've only got a couple of terminals, couple of laptops or devices, whatever, take a physical backup. Just make sure that's kept separate from the IT devices. That might be a simple way if you're quite a small organization. If you're a larger organization and you've got sort of much more sort of corporate systems, it's worth looking at whoever you're using. Does it provide you with the ability to take multiple versions of backed up data? And sometimes this is something they might charge a little bit extra for, but I would definitely say it's something very worth having, because if you do end up either accidentally deleting, which does happen, or suffering a ransomware attack that encrypts your backups, having those multiple versions means that you've always got a clean one that you can turn to. Instead of that, your provider might offer you the ability to undo changes to backups, and just making sure that obviously you kind of follow the things talked about earlier around limiting the number of accounts that can access those backups and things like that. Just protect them like you would the information if you were physically transferring it between two places, particularly if it involves sort of sensitive personal data and things like that. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I would add to that. But if you are considering kind of procuring some sort of service like that, there is some advice on the website. It's under an article called Cloud Backup Options for Mitigating the Threat of Ransomware is the title of the blog. So it's very sensibly titled. But please do have a look at that, and that should be able to talk you through different options in terms of procurement for an organisation like yours.
Great. That's an actually nice tie into David Briggs's question next. And he's like, so, is it kind of wrong to assume that the likes of Google Drive and Salesforce back up data automatically? I mean, listening to kind of your answer there, it seems like best practice is to kind of do this yourself anyways. Yeah,
so I think just on the first bit, is it safe to assume that? No, it's not safe to ever assume that something is backing up. We've had cases in the past and spoken to organisations that have fallen victims to attack that said, I could have sworn we were backing up everything, or the piece of software said that it backs up automatically. And yes, absolutely, it might well do. Quite often there is a requirement for the user or the IT person, whoever it is, to actually turn that functionality on. It may be that it's an added extra on the package that you have, or something like that. So I would just kind of say here, if you're using one of those cloud services, whether it's cloud accounting, whatever it might be, just make sure that you really understand what is being backed up, how regularly it's being backed up, and where it's being backed up to. And if possible, obviously, as I said before, take multiple versions of that backed up data. When it comes to accounting software, going back to where I talked about offline backups, it might be worth downloading a copy on a weekly basis and just putting it on some sort of offline device that you keep separate from your IT systems, because that just gives you that added layer of security, at least in your mind, that you've got a physical copy of all of your financial records, because there is a requirement to keep those for certain amounts of time, depending on what they are. So, Chris, I think you're muted.
I did. I fell into the trap.
Yeah.
Happens to the best of us, you see. Next question from Simon. The suspicious email service looks great. Are there any plans to do something similar with SMS messaging? I'm aware some mobile networks offer a service to forward suspicious text messages. That's a great question.
Yes, absolutely. There already is. So it's a service that exists for everybody, and I'm just going to find the exact number before I get it wrong. So if you receive a SMS message, you can forward the text to 7726, which any of the eagle-eyed out there amongst you will realise that spells out spam on a traditional keyboard. So yes, there is a service that already exists. It's not one that we offer. It's done, I believe, through Ofcom. I think they own it, but it's been around for a number of years. It's just not that well publicised. But it's very simply forward the spam text to 7726, and it just alerts the network providers, and they can take some action off the back of it. So 7726, and it spells out spam on a traditional phone keyboard, like a Nokia 3310 or something.
That's a throwback.
I know.
Brilliant. No, I didn't even know about that one. I've had some pretty elaborate phishing text messages before from the likes of HSBC or banks and stuff where it looks legit. So that's a really good one. Every day is a school day.
Exactly.
Next question from Sue. Can you get this report at phishing.gov.uk onto Facebook for them to share and help get it viral? Essentially, is there a Facebook NCSC account that she could link to? There is.
If you literally just search on Facebook, the National Cybersecurity Centre. I'm really sorry, I'm terrible with social media, so I will just double check what the name of the account is. But yes, I can't see off the top of my head, but we are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn. So look us up. We will have been posting about it in the last sort of few days. So please do retweet or repost those as you see them. You can also, if you're looking for some general advice for staying safe as families at home, we launched that alongside the Cyber Aware campaign. So that's the the government's public campaign around being aware of cybersecurity as individuals. And that information is all, if you just Google cyber aware, it will come up, and that has links to all of the Facebook links and things as well.
Magic. We can pop those in our resources as well. Sticking with the phishing reporting service, Daffod Lewis asks, does it help for you to receive the emails as attachments, or is it just straight on forwarding them through?
Either way, doesn't make any difference to the service. It scans the attachments, it scans the links, it scans everything. So if it's easier, most people typically just using their phone or the laptop, just click forward and type in report at phishing.gov.uk, and it will get to us, and we'll be able to take action off the back of it.
Great, thanks for clarifying. I think we might have covered this already, Cub, so feel free to say if we have. Carl Creffer asks, how secure are SharePoint and OneDrive when it comes to storing sensitive data?
So we can't talk about individual kind of platforms. What I would say is much the same as most of these services, the cloud kind of services like that. It's all in the way that they're configured. So making sure that your users are only able to access it with the level of security that you're happy with, whether that's just a password, whether that's multi-factor authentication, and making sure that's in place. And then from there, I would just kind of add that it's worth making sure that settings like, do you allow people to share live documents outside of the organization? It's a great functionality in things like SharePoint and those kind of live document storage facilities. But are you actually just sharing access to a lot more files than people think? It's very easy to share a whole folder instead of a whole document. So it's worth considering whether you want to allow your staff to do that, or whether when they send stuff outside the organization, you want them to send a copy. It just helps control access to your corporate systems.
Thanks, Cub. And the next one from Elspeth Sully. It's a bit of an in-depth, difficult question, so I think I'm going to sort of caveat with it. I don't think we'll be able to give you an answer, but it's something we can probably take offline. She asks, is there not a problem with the transcripts and the storage in Zoom, and is this different between the free version and the paid version?
I think you're absolutely right, Chris. It's not a question I'm going to be able to answer in any detail today, but absolutely we'll take it offline, and we'll get an answer back to you, or at least, at the very least, be able to point you to some guidance around the security of those individual questions.
Yeah, leave that one with us, please. Thanks a lot. Edward Fitzel asks, back switching to passwords, would you recommend password managers? I use LastPass, which I find great. Internally, we use Okta as well. So there's a couple of great ones out there.
Yeah, we love password managers now, purely for the reason that, for a long time, and I will admit to a terrible piece of government advice for a number of years, which was, we used to say, make your passwords long and complicated, don't ever write them down, protect them with your life. Actually, if you're able to put your password somewhere secure, now that might be a password manager, LastPass and Okta have both been mentioned. It might just be very simply when your internet browser says, would you like to save that password? You can click yes. Our advice to citizens and individuals now is absolutely save them in your browser, save them in a password manager, whatever you feel most comfortable with. For me, I use a password manager in my personal life, just because I move between different platforms. That's easier for me to do that. But yeah, absolutely. Just make sure that the password that you're securing the password manager with is a really good, strong one. Perhaps turn on two-factor authentication if that's available. But the reason we're quite supportive of them now and really advocate people to use them is because it allows you to have lots of different passwords across all your important accounts and not have to remember any of them. The only thing it will drive people mad, and I'll admit to this, is when you share something like an Amazon account in your family and you've made the password something completely different to all the others and they don't have access to your password manager. You will get a lot of complaints from children and significant others that they can't buy anything off Amazon. So I'd just flag that to you before you start using it and not telling everyone else that you've done it.
Great, thanks very much. And the last question, we've got the last question from Ingrid. Similar vein, I know you'll not be able to align specifically, but I think I can give some insight to this as well. Ingrid understands that some of the video conference systems are more dependent on this like self-added security than others, or there's some systems that are automatically more secure than others. You know, a lot of them have the sort of built-in end-to-end encryption already. But as I think you and I actually discussed not that long ago, it's about what happens when you go outside of that encryption. Before I could dive in, Ingrid, we actually released a podcast on Tuesday, I believe it was, that covered a lot of these sorts of questions in depth. So I'm going to point you to that as well, and we'll include that in the resources because that talked about specific software and what you can do from a security point in there. Just to sort of take a little bit of weight off Cub for that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, obviously being government, we can't recommend individual products, but I'd be very hesitant to anyway, because I think I would just caution you on taking anything that is kind of in sales bump that says it's secure out of the box. You should always do your own, audit checks, making sure that actually the security measures that you have decided in your risk assessments and things like that are in place, are actually turned on. What level of encryption is right for the type of data that you're passing, and just consider an individual solution for yourself. I don't, while obviously it's important to consider what your peers and things like that are doing, you need to make sure that the solution you choose is right for your organization. I think anyone that sort of preaches that one is better than the other is probably not being wholly honest, because I think you really do need to consider the individual controls and how relevant they are for your organization.
Amazing. Well, that is it. That's all the questions. Big thanks to Cub. Another, amazing sort of run through there and great session. And of course, for sticking with us for the added time to run through the questions as well. Massively appreciated. And of course, thank you to all of us for joining us today and spending a little bit of time chatting about security. Magically important. So thanks very much. And thanks for being so engaged and putting all those questions through. There was a lot. As always, the resources and feedback will be available through in the next week or so. We'll be sending them out via email. So don't forget to check in on those. If you would like to take a few minutes to submit some feedback to us, that would be greatly appreciated. And we're always looking to improve our webinar service and make sure we're bringing the right content to you at the right time. So please take a few minutes to tap on the feedback link and let us know how we did. Coming up in the next few weeks, so if you've been following our podcast series, we've been running a specific COVID podcast every Tuesday. Next up this Tuesday coming is a look forwards. We're taking on the positive, and we're bringing in Coopsies and a few other charities to look at how we'll be operating post-lockdown, and what has become the sort of buzzword as the new normal. And that'll be followed by a podcast with Just Given on how to fundraise in isolation and beyond. If you want to keep an eye out for those, please do head over to your podcast provider, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Acast or anything like that, and do subscribe, and then you'll get notified when they do go out every Tuesday morning. We're also next Thursday, we're going to be releasing a lot of our webinar and podcast and sort of content material that we created for Digital Fundraising Day back in November. It seems like a million miles away now. But a lot of this content's really pertinent, so we thought it's best to share it with our wider audience, to have you engage and use it to take back to your organization and implement it there. So next Thursday we'll be releasing the video that we had on the day from Trillium, which is people over platform and top tips for keeping your fundraising goals front of mind during digital transformation, or rapid digital transformation as we're all going through now. It basically just covers how you can, bring your people along and, implement that digital culture alongside the remote working. Our next live webinar will be on May 21st, and that's with Acquia. And that's the sort of a deep dive into how to boost your digital fundraising with online experiences. We'll be covering some great examples of charities who are doing this already, and then we'll be working into the nuances of how you can build this into your charities. Thank you once again. Stay safe, stay sane, and we'll hopefully see you very, very soon. Have a good long weekend. Thanks a lot.